The richest man in the city owned everything except the one sound he secretly missed: a child's laughter. People believed Vincent Romano had everything a man could ever want. They saw the sprawling estate overlooking the Hudson River, the fleet of black luxury SUVs gliding through the iron gates, the tailored suits, the private chefs, the polished marble floors that reflected crystal chandeliers worth more than most homes. They saw power. They saw influence. They saw a man who never smiled unless business demanded it. What they never saw was the silence. Every morning began exactly the same. At precisely 6:30 a.m., sunlight spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows into a mansion so large it echoed with emptiness. The grandfather clock in the foyer marked each passing second with mechanical precision, while servants moved quietly from room to room, careful not to disturb the man who preferred solitude over conversation. Vincent rarely noticed them. To him, people had become predictable. Some wanted money. Others wanted favors. Many wanted proximity to power. Few expected nothing in return. Years of disappointment had taught him that kindness almost always arrived with invisible strings attached. That belief had become the invisible wall surrounding his life. Then Grace Carter walked through the front entrance carrying a single worn suitcase in one hand and holding the tiny hand of her 6-year-old daughter with the other. Grace kept her shoulders straight despite the obvious nervousness in her eyes. She had answered an employment advertisement looking for a live-in housekeeper after losing her apartment when medical bills consumed nearly everything she had saved. She wasn't searching for luxury. She was searching for stability. Beside her stood Lily, wearing faded blue sneakers with tiny white daisies painted near the toes and clutching a well-loved stuffed rabbit whose ears had been stitched together more than once. Instead of staring at the towering staircase or the expensive artwork lining the walls, Lily looked around with quiet curiosity, as if she had entered the pages of one of her favorite storybooks. "Mom," she whispered softly enough that only Grace could hear. "Does someone really live here all alone?" Grace squeezed her daughter's hand gently before nodding. "Remember our promise," she whispered back. "We do our best, we show respect, and we stay grateful." Lily nodded with complete seriousness, the way only children could when they believed promises were sacred things. From the second-floor balcony, hidden behind the carved wooden railing, Vincent watched the exchange without making a sound. He had reviewed Grace's background himself. Honest employment. No criminal history. Excellent references. Years of hard work. A single mother doing everything she could for her daughter. Nothing unusual. Yet experience had taught him that paper never revealed character. Character appeared only when no one believed they were being watched. His long-time butler quietly stepped beside him. "They're settled into the guest cottage, sir." Vincent kept his eyes on the little girl below as she stopped beside an enormous vase filled with fresh white lilies. She smiled at the flowers without touching them, then looked toward a portrait hanging above the fireplace, and tilted her head as though silently wondering about the lonely man in the painting. "Children don't know how to pretend for long," Vincent murmured almost to himself. "That's why they reveal the truth faster than adults." The butler glanced at him with quiet curiosity but asked no questions. Vincent's gaze never left the child. Somewhere beneath decades of carefully built emotional armor, a forgotten memory stirred so faintly he barely recognized it before pushing it away again. By sunset, he had already made his decision. Tomorrow, he would conduct a simple test. He would close his eyes, pretend to be asleep, and discover whether genuine kindness still existed in a world that had taught him never to believe in it. The following afternoon settled over the Romano estate with the calm confidence of a place where nothing unexpected was ever allowed to happen. Sunlight poured through the enormous windows, warming polished oak floors until they glowed like amber. Grace worked quietly in the east wing, carefully dusting bookshelves that seemed to stretch forever while reminding herself not to make a single mistake on her first full day. Every movement carried the weight of responsibility because this job was more than employment. It was a chance to rebuild a future she thought she had already lost. Lily spent the morning helping in the smallest ways she could. She folded kitchen towels with determined little hands, even though each towel ended up slightly crooked. She smiled at every member of the staff and thanked the chef for a glass of apple juice as if he had given her the greatest gift in the world. The older employees exchanged quiet glances whenever she skipped past them because they could not remember the last time genuine innocence had wandered these silent halls. Vincent noticed everything without appearing to notice anything. Standing in his office, he watched security footage from different rooms, not because he distrusted the child but because he wanted answers that could never be found in reports or interviews. Lily never touched anything that was not hers. She admired expensive sculptures from a respectful distance. She paused to straighten a picture frame that had shifted slightly on the wall, then continued walking with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. There was no audience. No reward waiting. Only instinct. Still, Vincent was not convinced. Experience had taught him that first impressions often faded by the second day. Late that afternoon he quietly left his office and entered the sunroom overlooking the gardens. It was one of the few places in the mansion where the afternoon light softened the edges of everything it touched. Birds gathered near the fountain outside, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh roses through the open windows. He settled into an oversized leather chair, placed an unread book across his chest, closed his eyes, and slowed his breathing until it became perfectly steady. Anyone walking into the room would believe he had fallen asleep after a long day. His butler appeared in the doorway a moment later. Vincent never opened his eyes, but he spoke softly enough that only the older man could hear. "Do not interrupt. No matter what happens." The butler hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yes, sir." Minutes passed. The mansion remained wrapped in its familiar silence until tiny footsteps echoed faintly across the hardwood floor. Vincent recognized the light rhythm immediately. Lily. She stopped just inside the doorway. He could almost picture the expression on her face without looking. Curious. Careful. Kind. She stood there for several long seconds, saying nothing. Then he heard the quiet rustle of fabric as she hugged her stuffed rabbit closer. "Mr. Romano?" she whispered with gentle uncertainty. There was no answer. She waited. "Are you sleeping?" Still, he did not move. Another silence followed, longer this time. Finally he heard the softest little sigh, the kind that only a worried child could make. Instead of running away or calling for someone else, Lily took one careful step closer, then another, until she stood only a few feet from the man everyone else in the house seemed almost afraid to approach. Vincent remained perfectly still, but behind his closed eyes he felt something unfamiliar beginning to crack. Whatever happened next would tell him more about the little girl than any background check or recommendation letter ever could. For another long moment Lily simply watched him breathe. Adults always rushed. They hurried through conversations, hurried through meals, hurried through every promise they made. Children noticed different things. She noticed the faint lines beneath Vincent's eyes, the way one hand rested loosely against the closed book across his chest, and the quiet loneliness that seemed to linger in the room even while the afternoon sunshine filled every corner. "You must be really tired," she whispered to herself. "Mom says people only fall asleep sitting up when they forget to take care of themselves." She looked toward the hallway, wondering if she should find her mother, but something stopped her. Grace had spent all morning teaching her an important lesson. If someone looked like they needed kindness, you did not wait for permission to be kind. Lily slipped out of the room as quietly as she had entered. Vincent almost opened his eyes, convinced the test had ended, but less than 2 minutes later those tiny footsteps returned. This time she carried a folded cream-colored blanket that was clearly much too large for her little arms. She struggled across the polished floor, nearly tripping over one corner before catching herself with determined concentration. Standing beside the chair, she stretched onto her tiptoes. The blanket barely reached over the top of Vincent's shoulders. She frowned, adjusted one side, then carefully tucked the other around his arm the way her mother always covered her after she fell asleep on the couch. "There," she whispered with quiet satisfaction. "Now you will not get cold." Vincent remained perfectly motionless, but every word landed somewhere deep inside him. Lily studied his face again. "You still look sad." she said so softly that the words almost disappeared into the peaceful room. She looked around before spotting a nearby decorative pillow resting on another chair. Dragging it across the floor required both hands and nearly all her strength, but eventually she lifted it just high enough to slide it beneath Vincent's elbow. "Mom says sleeping is easier when you are comfortable." She stepped back, admiring her work with innocent pride. Then she remembered the stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. For a second she hugged it tightly against her chest. The rabbit had gone everywhere with her since she was 3 years old. Its fur had faded from years of bedtime cuddles, and one button eye sat slightly crooked after Grace had sewn it back into place. Lily bit her lower lip, thinking very carefully. Finally she nodded to herself. "You can borrow Mr. Button's," she whispered as though making a very serious agreement. She gently placed the little rabbit beside Vincent's hand. "He helps me when I have scary dreams. Maybe he will help you too." The room grew impossibly quiet. Outside, water splashed softly from the stone fountain, while birds chirped somewhere beyond the rose garden. Inside, a little girl reached into the pocket of her tiny cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper covered in colorful crayon drawings. She hesitated only a moment before sliding it beneath the edge of the book resting on Vincent's chest. "This is for when you wake up," she said with a smile that no one appeared to see. "It says today is a good day to smile because somebody is happy you are here." Without expecting thanks, without looking around for praise, Lily gave one last gentle glance toward the sleeping man before quietly walking toward the doorway. Vincent kept his breathing steady until her footsteps faded into the hallway, but behind his closed eyes the carefully guarded walls around his heart had begun to shift in ways he had not believed were still possible. Vincent waited until he could no longer hear Lily's footsteps before allowing himself the smallest breath that did not belong to the role he was playing. His fingers twitched beneath the blanket she had so carefully arranged, but he resisted the urge to sit up. The test was not over. Genuine kindness was easy when someone was watching. Real character appeared when a person believed the moment had already passed. He settled deeper into the chair and closed his eyes once more. A few minutes later the grandfather clock chimed 4 slow notes that drifted through the mansion like gentle waves. Somewhere in the distance Grace thanked another member of the staff for showing her where fresh linens were stored. The ordinary sounds of the estate continued exactly as they always had, yet something inside the quiet house already felt different. Soon the tiny footsteps returned again, slower this time, almost hesitant. Lily peeked around the doorway and smiled with relief when she saw that the blankets still covered Vincent's shoulders. "Good," she whispered. "You are still warm." She carried a small glass of water with both hands, moving so carefully that only a few drops escaped over the rim. The glass looked much too heavy for someone her age, but she refused to give up until she reached the small table beside the chair. She placed it down with remarkable care before looking around the room. "Mom always puts water near my bed when I am sick," she explained to the sleeping man. "Maybe you will want some later." She folded her little hands together, thinking hard. Suddenly she noticed that one corner of the blanket had slipped toward the floor. Without hesitation she bent down, lifted it, and tucked it gently back around Vincent's arm. Her movements were slow and thoughtful, as though she were afraid of disturbing a dream. Vincent had spent years watching people negotiate million-dollar contracts with less concentration than this little girl used while straightening a blanket. Then Lily heard him clear his throat. It was only a quiet sound, one Vincent had made without thinking, but to her it meant something entirely different. Her green eyes widened with concern. "Oh no," she whispered. "You really are not feeling well." She looked toward the hallway again before making another decision entirely on her own. "Please wait here," she said with complete sincerity, forgetting for a moment that sleeping people could not answer. She hurried away as fast as her little legs could carry her. Less than 3 minutes later she returned carrying a small white plate. On it rested half of a peanut butter sandwich cut into uneven triangles and 2 round apple slices. Vincent recognized the lunch Grace had packed for her that morning. Lily carefully placed the plate beside the glass of water and smiled. "I was saving this for later," she admitted quietly. But Mommy says people heal faster when they eat something. She looked at the sandwich for a second, her stomach giving the faintest little growl that only someone sitting inches away could have heard. Still, she gently pushed the plate closer to Vincent instead of taking a bite herself. "You can have all of it," she whispered. "I can eat later." Those simple words settled over the room with a weight far greater than any business agreement Vincent had ever signed. A child who had almost nothing had just given away the only meal she still had left that afternoon, expecting absolutely nothing in return. Hidden behind closed eyes, Vincent felt a warmth rise into his chest that no amount of wealth had ever been able to buy, and for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, remaining perfectly still became far more difficult than pretending to sleep. Grace glanced at the small clock hanging above the laundry room sink and smiled to herself. Lily should have finished her snack by now. She wiped her hands on a clean towel before carrying a neatly folded stack of fresh linens toward the guest cottage, expecting to find her daughter sitting on the front steps with Mr. Buttons in her lap, humming one of the little songs she always invented. Instead, the porch was empty. Grace set the towels down and checked inside. The tiny bedroom was spotless. The stuffed rabbit was gone. So were Lily's little blue sneakers. "Lily?" she called gently, assuming her daughter had wandered only a few feet away. There was no answer. She stepped back outside, her smile fading just enough for concern to quietly replace it. The estate was enormous. Flower gardens stretched across acres of carefully maintained grounds. Stone pathways curved around fountains and ancient oak trees. For an adult it felt impressive. For a 6-year-old it could feel endless. Grace walked toward the kitchen first. "Has anyone seen my daughter?" she asked with polite urgency. The pastry chef shook his head. One of the gardeners had not seen her either. A housekeeper mentioned spotting Lily walking toward the east wing nearly half an hour earlier. Grace thanked everyone, but her heartbeat began to quicken with every passing minute. She trusted Lily completely. Her daughter never wandered without a reason. That was exactly what frightened her. She hurried through hallway after hallway, calling Lily's name a little louder each time. Staff members immediately joined the search, checking the library, the music room, the indoor garden, and every sitting area on the first floor. Even the security team quietly spread throughout the mansion after receiving word that the little girl could not be found. No one panicked, but everyone moved with purpose. Vincent heard every distant voice while keeping his eyes closed. He recognized Grace's footsteps before she even reached the hallway outside the sunroom. They carried the unmistakable rhythm of a mother trying not to let fear take control. She paused outside the doorway, breathing deeply before stepping inside. The moment she entered, she noticed a folded blanket draped over Vincent's shoulders. Then she saw the glass of water, the half sandwich, the apple slices, and finally the little stuffed rabbit resting beside his hand. Her eyes slowly widened as every piece of the quiet mystery came together. Before she could speak, Lily quietly appeared behind her carrying a tiny flower she had picked up from the garden path after asking one of the gardeners if it had already fallen naturally from the bush. "Mom," she whispered, careful not to disturb the sleeping man. "Please use your quiet voice." Grace turned so quickly that tears immediately filled her eyes. She dropped to one knee and wrapped both arms around her daughter. "I have been looking everywhere for you," she said softly, relief making her voice tremble. Lily hugged her back without understanding why her mother looked so worried. "I did not want to leave him alone," she explained with complete innocence. "He looked lonely before he fell asleep. Then he sounded like he had a cold, so I gave him my lunch because soup was too hard to carry." Grace looked from her daughter's sincere face to the untouched sandwich beside Vincent, and felt emotion catch in her throat. She gently brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind Lily's ear. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "that was your lunch." Lily simply shrugged with the uncomplicated wisdom only a child could possess. "That is okay. He probably needed it more than I did." Hidden behind closed eyelids, Vincent felt those simple words settle into the deepest corners of a heart that had spent years believing generosity was always measured by what people had left over, never by what they were willing to give away. Grace was still holding Lily close when a quiet rustling sound came from the leather chair. The room fell completely still. Vincent slowly lifted one hand from beneath the blanket before opening his eyes for the first time that afternoon. Grace immediately stood, embarrassed that her daughter had wandered into the private sunroom without permission. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, her voice filled with sincere concern. "She should not have disturbed you. I will clean everything up immediately." Vincent did not answer right away. His gaze rested on the tiny stuffed rabbit beside him. He picked it up carefully, running one thumb across the worn fabric and the slightly crooked button eye. It had clearly been repaired many times. Someone had loved it enough to keep fixing it instead of replacing it. Then he noticed the folded drawing tucked beneath the book on his lap. Slowly unfolding the paper, he found a bright crayon picture of a smiling man standing beneath a yellow sun. Beside him stood a little girl holding his hand while flowers covered the grass around them. Across the top, written in uneven block letters, were the words, "Today is a good day to smile." Vincent stared at the drawing for several silent seconds. His vision blurred before he realized moisture had gathered in his eyes. It had been years since anything so small had carried such unimaginable weight. Lily stepped closer without fear. "I made that for you," she said softly. "Because nobody smiles when they are sad for too long." Grace gently reached for her daughter's shoulder, trying to encourage her to step back, but Vincent quietly raised one hand. "It is all right," he said, his voice lower than usual. Lily tilted her head. "Are you feeling better now?" He looked at the untouched sandwich resting beside the glass of water. "You gave me your lunch." Lily nodded as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "You looked like you needed it more." Vincent swallowed slowly. "But then you would be hungry." She smiled with complete certainty. "Being hungry for a little while is not scary. Being lonely is." The words settled over the room like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment, overwhelmed by the innocence only a child could possess. Vincent looked away toward the gardens beyond the windows. For an instant the sparkling fountain disappeared, replaced by a memory he had spent years trying to bury. He remembered another little voice asking if he would come home early. Another small drawing folded inside a jacket pocket. Another promise that life had never given him the chance to keep. The memory arrived quietly, without anger or regret, only an aching reminder that love had once existed inside these walls. Before silence claimed everything. A single tear escaped before he could stop it. He quickly turned his face, but Lily had already seen it. Without asking permission, she walked over and gently wrapped both little arms around one of his. She did not speak. She did not ask why he was crying. She simply stayed there, offering comfort the same way she would have comforted anyone else. Vincent looked down at the child leaning against him and felt something inside finally give way. Years of suspicion, distance, and carefully controlled emotion suddenly seemed much smaller than one little girl who believed every lonely person deserved kindness. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the mansion no longer felt empty. It felt as though a tiny heartbeat had quietly found its way into every silent room. That evening the mansion settled into its familiar rhythm, but Vincent found himself unable to return to his usual routine. The contracts waiting on his desk remained untouched. The conference calls were postponed with a single instruction to his assistant. Even the cup of freshly brewed coffee beside him grew cold, while his thoughts remained fixed on one little girl who had offered away her only meal without a second thought. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded Lily's crayon drawing once again. The paper had already developed a soft crease from being opened so many times in a single afternoon. His eyes lingered on the uneven letters across the top. "Today is a good day to smile." It was astonishing how a sentence written by a 6-year-old carried more truth than speeches he had heard from powerful executives for decades. A gentle knock sounded on the office door before his longtime butler stepped inside. "You wish to see me, sir?" Vincent nodded without looking up from the drawing. "Everything we have on Grace Carter." The older man hesitated. "Employment records?" Vincent slowly raised his eyes. "Everything." Less than an hour later, a modest folder rested on the polished walnut desk. Vincent expected another collection of ordinary documents. Instead, he discovered the quiet story of a woman who had spent years choosing integrity over convenience. Grace had worked 2 jobs while attending evening certification classes after her husband passed away from a sudden illness 3 years earlier. She had declined financial offers that required dishonest bookkeeping, even when accepting them would have erased every unpaid bill she carried. Former employers described her with nearly identical words: dependable, honest, compassionate. One handwritten reference from an elderly woman caught Vincent's attention more than any official record. Grace once stayed after her shift every Friday evening just to read books aloud to my husband after he lost most of his eyesight. She never accepted extra money. She said kindness should not come with an invoice. Vincent quietly closed the letter and leaned back in his chair. He stared through the office windows toward the small guest cottage where a warm light now glowed behind lace curtains. Through the distance he could just make out Grace sitting beside Lily at the tiny kitchen table. They appeared to be sharing a simple dinner while laughing over something written in one of Lily's schoolbooks. There were no expensive decorations. No extravagant furniture. Only warmth. The kind of warmth that could never be purchased. She raised that child alone, Vincent said quietly. The butler nodded. According to the records, she has never missed one parent conference at school, despite working multiple jobs. Her daughter's teachers consistently described Lily as unusually generous for her age. Vincent smiled faintly, almost without realizing it. Children learn what they live. The butler noticed the change immediately. It was small, almost impossible for anyone else to detect, but after serving Vincent for more than 20 years, he recognized it at once. The loneliness that had surrounded his employer like a permanent shadow seemed just a little lighter. Vincent stood and walked toward the window, watching as Grace tucked Lily into bed through the softly lit cottage window. Before closing the curtains, Lily held up Mr. Buttons and pretended the little rabbit was waving toward the mansion. Vincent instinctively lifted one hand in return, knowing she could not possibly see him from that distance. Yet somehow the simple gesture felt natural. Tomorrow, he said quietly, still watching the glowing cottage across the garden, I want Lily enrolled in the best private elementary school in the county. The butler blinked in surprise. Should I tell Miss Carter who arranged it? Vincent slowly shook his head. No. If kindness expects applause, it becomes a transaction. Let her believe the opportunity simply found its way to them. As the office lights dimmed behind him, Vincent realized that for the first time in many years he was no longer thinking about protecting his fortune. He was thinking about protecting 2 people who had unknowingly reminded him what a truly wealthy life was supposed to feel like. The next morning arrived with crisp autumn air drifting through the open kitchen windows of the guest cottage. Grace poured oatmeal into 2 simple bowls while Lily happily arranged fresh blueberries into the shape of a smiling face. Their little breakfast table was modest, but it carried the comfortable warmth that only genuine love could create. Grace noticed her daughter humming to herself. You seem extra happy today, she said with a smile. Lily nodded without looking up. I dreamed Mr. Romano smiled at me. Grace chuckled softly. That would certainly surprise everyone in this house. Across the estate, Vincent stood in his study watching the sunrise paint the gardens gold. His assistant entered carrying a leather portfolio. Everything has been arranged, sir. The scholarship fund has been transferred anonymously. Lily Carter has been accepted into St. Eleanor Academy beginning next semester. The tuition, books, uniforms, transportation, and future educational expenses have all been secured through a private educational trust. Vincent simply nodded. Good. There is one more matter, the assistant continued. Miss Carter's outstanding medical debt has also been settled through an independent charitable foundation, exactly as you instructed. No connection can be traced back to you. Vincent looked out toward the guest cottage once more. Make certain it stays that way. Later that afternoon, Grace received 2 unexpected phone calls less than an hour apart. The first came from the billing department of the hospital where she had spent months making small monthly payments after her husband's final illness. The representative politely informed her that her balance had been paid in full by an anonymous donor. Grace stood frozen in the laundry room, convinced there had been some kind of mistake. Before she could fully process the news, her phone rang again. This time it was St. Eleanor Academy. The admissions director warmly congratulated Lily on receiving one of the school's most prestigious community scholarships. Grace thanked the woman repeatedly before ending the call, her hands trembling with disbelief. She sat down on a wooden bench, staring at the phone in silence. Nothing about her life had ever been this easy. Blessings had always arrived wrapped inside impossible sacrifices. Lily skipped into the room carrying Mr. Buttons beneath one arm. "Mom, why are you crying?" Grace quickly wiped away the tears and smiled. "These are happy tears." Lily climbed onto the bench beside her. "Did something good happen?" Grace nodded slowly. "Something wonderful happened." Lily thought for a moment before looking toward the mansion visible through the laundry room window. "Maybe somebody prayed for us." Grace followed her daughter's gaze without saying a word. At that exact moment Vincent happened to be standing in the sunroom looking toward the cottage. Neither of them could clearly see the other through the afternoon light, yet for one brief instant it felt as though gratitude quietly crossed the distance between two completely different worlds. That evening Lily knocked gently on the sunroom door before stepping inside with a small flower tucked behind one ear. Vincent looked up from the book resting on his lap. "May I come in?" she asked politely. "Of course," he replied. Lily climbed onto the chair across from him and smiled. "Mom says when something wonderful happens, we should always say thank you, even if we do not know exactly who helped." Vincent closed his book and met her bright green eyes. "I think your mother is a very wise woman." Lily nodded confidently. "She says, kindness is like planting flowers. Sometimes you never see them bloom, but they still make somebody's world prettier." Vincent lowered his eyes for just a second, quietly absorbing every innocent word. In all the years he had spent building an empire, no boardroom, no investment, and no victory had ever taught him a lesson as valuable as the one a 6-year-old child had just shared without even realizing it. Several weeks passed, and the Romano estate no longer sounded quite the way it once had. The silence that had ruled every hallway for years now carried something softer. Every afternoon, just after Lily finished her lessons, the faint echo of her laughter drifted through the gardens as she chased butterflies or carefully watered flowers with one of the gardeners. The staff smiled more often. Even the old butler admitted to himself that the mansion somehow felt younger. Vincent never encouraged the attention, yet he no longer avoided it either. One cool Saturday morning, Lily knocked gently on the open door of his study, holding a large sheet of folded construction paper behind her back. "I made something," she announced proudly. Vincent looked up from the paperwork he had barely touched. "May I see it?" Lily walked forward and handed him the colorful page with both hands. He unfolded it slowly. Across the center was a drawing of the mansion surrounded by bright flowers beneath an enormous blue sky. 3 people stood together in front of the house. Grace, Lily, and him. Above them, written carefully in large uneven letters, was a sentence that stopped him completely. "Everybody needs a family." Vincent stared at the picture for a long time without speaking. "Do you like it?" Lily finally asked. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. "I do." She smiled. "I put you in the middle because houses are strongest in the middle." Vincent looked at her with quiet confusion. Lily pointed at the drawing. "Mom says families help each other hold everything together. So I thought you should stand there." Grace had quietly arrived at the doorway while carrying a basket of freshly folded towels. She stopped the moment she heard those words. Neither Vincent nor Lily noticed her standing there. Vincent carefully set the drawing on his desk as though it were the most valuable thing he had ever owned. "Lily," he said softly, "why were you so kind to me that first day? You did not even know me." Lily looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "You looked lonely. That was enough?" She nodded. You cannot always see when somebody is hurting, but sometimes you can feel it. The simplicity of her answer left the room completely still. Vincent slowly stood, walked around his desk, and knelt until he was at eye level with her. For years people had approached him because of his reputation, his influence, or his wealth. This little girl had approached him because she believed no one should have to feel alone. He gently opened his arms. Lily stepped forward without hesitation and hugged him tightly. Mr. Button squeezed between them. Vincent closed his eyes, returning the embrace with quiet gratitude. Grace watched from the doorway, tears shining in her eyes as she witnessed a moment she knew neither of them would ever forget. Vincent finally looked toward her and offered the warmest smile she had ever seen on his face. It was not the smile of a powerful businessman. It was the smile of a man who had finally remembered how to hope. The expensive paintings still covered the walls. The marble floors still reflected the afternoon sunlight. The mansion itself had not changed at all. The heart inside it had. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep with Mr. Buttons tucked beneath one arm, Vincent carefully placed her drawing inside a simple wooden frame and set it on the corner of his desk where every visitor could see it. Contracts would come and go. Fortunes could rise and fall. Buildings could be bought and sold. But one little girl had given him something no amount of money could ever purchase. She reminded him that true strength was never measured by the power to command others. It was measured by the courage to keep a gentle heart in a world that often forgot how precious kindness could be. And in the quiet that followed, Vincent finally understood that although he had pretended to be asleep to discover the truth about a child, it was that child who had awakened the part of his own soul he believed had been gone forever.